Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has nothing left but the will to start over. That's where 60-year-old Eli Boone found himself, broke, alone, staring at the charred remains of a ranch everyone said was cursed. For 30 years, the land sat abandoned after fire consumed it, a monument to tragedy locals preferred to forget. But Eli saw something different. With his last dollar and his faithful donkey Jasper by his side, he bought that burned dream and began the work of rebuilding, not just walls and beams, but his own weathered soul. What he found buried in the ash would change everything about second chances. Could a man with nothing rebuild more than just a house? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Eli Boone drove into Ashford, Montana, the sky hung low and gray like old wool, heavy with the promise of rain that might or might not come. His truck coughed and rattled with the kind of complaint that comes from too many miles on roads that were never quite smooth enough, from too many years without proper maintenance, from a life spent moving rather than settling. The engine's protest was familiar music to Eli's ears, the sound of something barely holding together but still going, still trying, still refusing to quit despite every good reason to do so. In the passenger seat, secured with frayed rope to keep him from sliding during turns, sat Jasper, a donkey with gray whiskers that matched Eli's own, with eyes that had seen just about everything worth seeing and had developed philosophical opinions about most of it. They'd been together 8 years now, ever since that auction in Wyoming when Eli had found him half-starved in a pen nobody was looking at, standing there with dignity despite his circumstances. Eli had bid his last $20, won him without competition, and figured they were both fools, destined to keep each other company through whatever came next. He'd been right about that. Ashford wasn't much to speak of, the kind of town that shows up on maps only because something has to be there to break up the empty spaces between larger places. When Main Street ran through it like a spine, a handful of buildings clinging to it like vertebrae that had weathered better than most of the people who occupied them. There was the sort of quiet here that settles over small towns when the young folks leave for college or the cities and don't come back. When the dreams that built the place have been replaced by the steady work of maintenance and survival. It was late April, and the cottonwoods along the single street were just beginning to bud, promising green that hadn't quite arrived yet. Eli pulled up to the general store, its wooden sign creaking in the wind that seemed to blow constantly across these Montana plains. The paint on the sign was faded to the point where you had to know what it said rather than being able to read it clearly. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment in the sudden silence, gathering himself for whatever came next. Through the dusty windshield, he could see the main street of Ashford stretching out before him, a post office, a diner, a bar with windows too dark to see through, a few houses set back from the road. This was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where a stranger was noted and discussed and evaluated before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. "Well," he said to Jasper, who was watching the street with the careful attention donkeys bring to new situations, "I guess this is it. Our last chance or our biggest mistake. A time will tell which." Jasper's ear twitched, the donkey's version of a shrug Eli had learned over the years. The animal had opinions, but kept most of them to himself, which was one of the many reasons Eli preferred his company to that of most people. Inside, the general store smelled of coffee and sawdust and time, that particular combination of scents that seems to accumulate in places that have been doing the same thing for decades, without much change. The floor was worn wood, grooved in places where countless feet had walked the same paths year after year. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the practical necessities of rural life: canned goods, work clothes, tools, ammunition, rope, seeds for planting. Nothing fancy, nothing frivolous, just what was needed to survive and work in country that demanded both from those who chose to live in it. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a silver braid that hung down her back like a plumb line. She wore a flannel shirt and jeans and the kind of practical boots that spoke of someone who'd done plenty of hard work in her day and wasn't afraid of more. She was sorting through receipts with the careful attention of someone who'd been doing the same task for 40 years, her fingers moving with the automatic precision of long practice. When the bell above the door announced Eli's entrance, she looked up with eyes that were sharp and evaluating, the kind of eyes that could size up a man in about 3 seconds and rarely got it wrong. "Help you?" she asked. The question wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't warm either. It was the careful neutrality of someone who'd seen enough strangers come and go to know that most of them brought some kind of trouble, even if it was just the trouble of explaining themselves. "Name's Eli Boone," he said, removing his hat in a gesture his father had taught him back when such things mattered, back when there were rules about how a man conducted himself in the presence of a lady. It was an old-fashioned gesture, probably out of date, but Eli figured there were worse things than holding on to a bit of courtesy in a world that seemed to have less of it every year. "I'm looking for Tom Ridley. Understand he's the land agent around here." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and Eli saw the calculation happening behind them. A stranger asking for the land agent meant only one thing. Someone was thinking about buying property. And in a town like Ashford, where property rarely changed hands, and when it did, it was usually within families. A stranger buying land was news that would spread before sunset. "Tom's office is 2 doors down," she said, setting down her pen. "Yellow building. Can't miss it, though the yellow's faded enough you might think it's white in certain light." She paused, her gaze steady on his face. "What brings you to Ashford, Mr. Boone?" "We don't get many visitors, and the ones we get usually have a specific reason for being here." "Came to buy some land," Eli said simply. He'd learned over the years that there was no point in being evasive. Small towns had ways of finding out everything anyway, and being straightforward at least earned you a bit of respect for not trying to hide. "We don't have much for sale around here. Land tends to stay in families, gets passed down or divided up among kids." "What did you hear about?" "The old Mercer place. The one that burned." The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable, like a door closing or a light going out. Her face, which had been neutral and mildly curious, went still and careful. Her hands stopped their sorting, and she looked at him with something that might have been concern or might have been disapproval. It was hard to tell which. "That land's not worth buying," she said flatly. "It's been sitting there 30 years for a reason, and that reason hasn't changed just because time's passed." "I'd still like to see it," Eli said, keeping his voice level and reasonable. She set down her papers completely now and regarded him with the kind of look that sees through pretense to the truth underneath. The kind of look that cuts through whatever story a man might tell himself and gets to what's really going on. "I'm Martha Henley. I run this store, and I've been in Ashford all my life. Born here, raised here, never left for more than a week or 2 at a time. That ranch, people call it cursed. And before you dismiss that as small-town superstition, you should know that 4 different families tried to make something of it before the fire. 4 families, Mr. Boone. None of them lasted more than a few years. They'd come in full of hope and plans, and they'd leave broken and broke, usually in debt, always with that look in their eyes, like they'd fought something they couldn't beat." She paused, and Eli could tell she was deciding how much to say, weighing her responsibility to warn him against the knowledge that he'd probably do what he wanted, regardless of her warnings. "Then the Brennans bought it in '88, she continued, her voice softer now, touched with genuine sadness. "Tom and Ellen Brennan seemed like real nice folks. Had 2 kids, boy and a girl, 7 and 9 years old. Sweet children. The kind that'd wave at you from their car window, that'd hold the door open for you at the post office. They worked that ranch hard for 6 years. Seemed like maybe they'd be the ones to break whatever curse or bad luck hung over the place." Martha's hands had gone still on the counter, and her eyes had a faraway look, seeing something from the past. "The fire was in '94. November, late at night when everyone was sleeping. By the time the neighbors saw the flames, it was too late. They died in that fire, all 4 of them. Parents and both kids. The investigation found evidence of arson, accelerant poured around the house, but they never found who did it. Never even found a good suspect. The case is still open, technically, but nobody's worked it in 20 years. She shook her head slowly. The land agent will sell it to you if you've got the money, Mr. Boone. That's his job, and he'll do it. But I'm telling you as a kindness, as someone who's seen enough heartbreak in this valley, some places are meant to stay empty. Some ground holds onto its sorrows, and trying to build on it is like trying to build on quicksand. It'll take you down eventually. Eli nodded slowly, taking in her words and the genuine concern behind them. He appreciated the warning, appreciated that she'd taken the time to tell him the full story instead of just directing him to the land agent. But he'd driven 600 miles to get here, following a lead he'd found in a farming journal's classified ads. And he wasn't going to turn back without at least looking at the place. "I appreciate the warning, Mrs. Henley," he said, and he meant it. "And I'll take it seriously. But I'd still like to see Tom Ridley and have a look at the property. Sometimes a man needs to see things for himself before he can decide what to do about them." She sighed, the way people do when they know their words aren't going to change a thing. When they've said what needed saying but understand that sometimes people have to make their own mistakes. "Yellow building, like I said. Tom's usually there this time of day. And Mr. Boone," she called after him as he turned to leave. "If you do buy that place, come back here. I'll put together some supplies for you. You'll need them." The yellow building, or what had once been yellow and was now a faded cream color that might charitably be called off-white, stood 2 doors down, exactly where Martha had said it would be. A small sign hung crooked in the window, "Ridley Land and Property Services." Eli tried the door and found it unlocked, opening into a small office that looked like it had been furnished sometime in the 1970s and hadn't been updated since. Tom Ridley's office smelled of old paper and resignation, of deal after deal that hadn't quite worked out the way anyone hoped. The man himself sat behind a desk piled with folders and loose papers, a calculator from another decade sitting next to a coffee cup that had a ring of residue around the inside. He looked like he'd spent too many years trying to sell things nobody wanted, his face settling into lines of practiced disappointment. When Eli told him what he'd come for, Ridley leaned back in his chair and laughed, not with humor, but with the bitter amusement of someone who'd heard this particular joke before and knew exactly how it would end. "The Mercer place," he said, shaking his head. "You're the 3rd person in 10 years to ask about it, and the other 2 changed their minds after they saw it. Can't say I blame them either." He pulled out a file folder thick with documents and history and accumulated paperwork. Dust motes danced in the air as he opened it, and Eli caught a whiff of paper that had been sitting in the same folder for years. "I'm legally obligated to tell you the property's history," Ridley said, his tone taking on the careful neutral quality of someone delivering bad news he's delivered many times before. "Fire in 1994, November 18th to be exact. Arson suspected but never proven. They found evidence of accelerant, found patterns consistent with intentional fire setting, but never identified a suspect or established a motive. 4 deaths: Thomas Brennan, age 38, Ellen Brennan, age 36, Jason Brennan, age 9, and Rebecca Brennan, age 7. He paused, looking up at Eli to make sure the weight of those words was landing. Property was seized by the county for back taxes in 97, after it sat with no heirs and no one willing to administer the estate. Been on the market ever since. $3,000 and it's yours, the buildings or what's left of them, and 60 acres of land. What kind of buildings are left? Not much, I'll be honest with you. Main house is mostly rubble. Fire burned hot and long, and what it didn't destroy, time and weather have worked on for 3 decades. Barns partially standing, though I wouldn't trust the structure without serious inspection and reinforcement. Some fence posts still up, some wire still strung, though most of it's rusted or broken. There's a stone chimney from the original house that's still standing. Stone doesn't burn, and it's held up over the years. That's about it. Ridley leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. his expression earnest in a way that suggested he was about to give advice he knew wouldn't be taken. "Look, I'll be straight with you, Mr. Boone. That land has a reputation. I don't believe in curses myself. Been in this business too long to believe in anything I can't write on a deed. But I believe in bad luck. And I believe in places that just don't work out, no matter who tries them. That place has had more than its share of both. You seem like a decent fellow, someone who's worked hard and saved his money. Why throw it away on a lost cause? There's other land for sale in the county, better land, land without the history. I could show you some places that might suit you better." Eli thought about the question, really thought about it. It was the same question he'd been asking himself for the past 600 miles, the same question that had kept him awake nights in cheap motels as he drove west with everything he owned in the back of his truck. Why this place? Why a burned-out ranch with a tragic history and a reputation for failure? He thought about the last 40 years of his life, working other men's ranches from Montana to New Mexico, sleeping in bunkhouses that all looked the same, moving when the seasons changed or the work dried up, or his restlessness got the better of him. He thought about his ex-wife Linda's face the day he'd left, not angry or accusatory but sad, like she'd known all along that he couldn't stay, that something in him would always be looking for the next horizon. He thought about his daughter Sarah, born during that brief marriage, raised by her mother and her mother's second husband, while Eli drifted from job to job, sending money when he had it and excuses when he didn't. He thought about the wedding invitation that had come 15 years ago, about how he'd been in Nevada working a ranch that paid in room and board more than actual cash, about how he'd sent a card and $50 and told himself it was better this way, that she didn't need a drifter father showing up to remind everyone of failure and broken promises, he thought, about being 60 years old with $3,000 to his name, the sum total of a lifetime of work, the entire accumulated wealth of 6 decades on Earth. He thought about Jasper waiting in the truck, the only companion he'd had for 8 years, the only living thing that depended on him. He thought about the future that stretched ahead, and how it was getting shorter with each passing year, and how he was running out of time to be anything other than what he'd always been. "Because," Eli said finally, choosing his words carefully, "I'm tired of working land that belongs to someone else. I'm tired of bunkhouses and temporary jobs and being able to pack everything I own in an hour. I'm tired of having nowhere to go home to at the end of the day, except a truck that's as old and worn out as I am. And if the place has bad luck, well, maybe I do too. Maybe it takes someone who's already failed at most things to succeed at something everyone else has failed at. Might be we deserve each other, that land and me." Ridley studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he nodded slowly. "Your funeral," he said, not unkindly. "I'll need the full amount up front, cash or certified check. County won't take payments or financing on this one. They just want it off their books." "Cash," Eli said, reaching for the envelope in his jacket pocket, the envelope that contained 30 $100 bills, crisp and clean because he'd withdrawn them from the bank in Billings just for this purpose. They completed the transaction in less than an hour, Ridley walking him through the paperwork with the efficient detachment of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Eli signed his name on line after line, his signature getting slightly messier as his hand cramped from writing. When it was done, Ridley handed him a deed, coffee-stained at one corner, faded from years in the file, but legal and binding, and now bearing Eli's name as owner. "The property's 12 miles north on County Road 47, Ridley said, drawing a rough map on the back of a business card. "Turn right on an unmarked dirt road just past mile marker 14. You'll see it on your left, or what's left of it anyway. Can't miss it, really. It's the only place up there that looks like it's been abandoned for 30 years. Eli walked out of that yellow building with the deed in his pocket, feeling its weight though it was just paper, feeling its significance though it was just words and signatures and a seal. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the late morning sun warm his face, letting the enormity of what he'd just done settle over him. For the first time in his 60 years, he owned something. Not much, maybe. Just 60 acres of cursed land and some burned buildings. But it was his. Martha was sweeping the front steps of her store when he emerged from Ridley's office. She looked at the paper in his hand and shook her head, but there was something in her expression that might have been respect mixed in with the disapproval. "You bought it," she said. "It wasn't a question, I did. You know where it is?" "How to get there?" "Ridley gave me directions. 12 miles north off County Road 47. Martha leaned her broom against the wall and turned back into the store, gesturing for him to follow. "Come on, then. Let me put together some supplies for you. You'll need them if you're really planning to stay out there." Inside, she moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, filling a cardboard box with practical things, matches in a waterproof container, a pound of ground coffee, canned goods, beans and stew and vegetables, rope that was good quality and strong, work gloves that looked like they'd hold up to hard use, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a box of nails, a roll of duct tape, a plastic tarp. When she was done, she added a loaf of bread and a package of beef jerky, then carried the whole thing to the counter. "That'll be $43, she said. Though Eli suspected if he'd added up the value of everything in the box, it would have been closer to $70. He paid her without comment on the discrepancy, understanding that this was her way of helping, while maintaining the fiction that it was just business as usual. "Why help me if you think I'm making a mistake?" he asked, as she counted out his change. Martha's face softened slightly, the hard lines around her eyes and mouth easing. "Because, mistakes or not, people still need to eat. And because," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "because maybe you're right. Maybe that land's been waiting for someone stubborn enough not to give up on it. The others who tried, they came with big plans and borrowed money and pressure to make it work. They needed it to succeed. But you don't look like a man who needs anything except a place to be. Maybe that's the difference. Maybe the land can tell the difference between desperation and determination." She handed him the box and added, "You come back next week. I'll want to hear how you're doing, whether you've given up yet or whether you're as stubborn as you look." The drive north took 20 minutes on a road that had seen better days, that had probably been paved once, but had broken down into a surface that was more patch than original pavement. County Road 47 ran straight through grazing land, past ranches that looked successful and established, past cattle that barely looked up as his truck rattled by. The land rolled gently here, not flat but not mountainous either, covered in grass that was just beginning to green up with spring growth. In the distance, mountains rose against the western sky, their peaks still white with snow that wouldn't melt until June. When Eli turned onto the unmarked dirt road just past mile marker 14, his truck immediately began complaining about the transition from bad pavement to worse dirt. The road, if you could call it that, was more a pair of ruts through overgrown grass, the kind of track that forms when a vehicle drives the same path repeatedly, but not often enough to keep it clear. Branches from encroaching brush scraped against the sides of his truck with a sound like fingernails on metal. Jasper brayed once from his position in the passenger seat, registering what might have been concern or might have been commentary on Eli's driving choices. "I know," Eli said. "But we're committed now, paid for it and everything. Might as well see what we bought." The track climbed gradually for about a quarter mile, winding around rocks and following the path of least resistance through the landscape. Then it crested a small rise, and the land opened up before them, and Eli's breath caught in his throat, not with horror at what he saw, though the destruction was real enough, but with something else, something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or recognition, or the feeling of something that had been lost, finding its way home. The main house was indeed mostly gone. What remained was a scatter of blackened timbers, jutting up from the ground like broken bones, like the ribs of some great beast that had died here and been left to bleach in the sun. The foundation was still visible, a rectangle of stone and concrete that defined where walls had once stood, where rooms had been arranged, where a family had lived out their daily lives. Nothing remained of the roof, that had burned or collapsed or both, consumed by fire and time. The windows were empty spaces, jagged with broken glass at the edges, staring out like blind eyes. Ash and char covered everything, though 30 years of wind and rain had begun to blur the sharp evidence of the fire, softening the destruction into something that looked almost natural, like the land was slowly taking back what had been built on it. The barn stood about 50 yards from the house, and it was in slightly better condition, which was to say that it was still partially standing rather than completely collapsed. It leaned heavily to one side, its red paint long since peeled away to reveal weathered grey wood underneath. Large gaps showed in the walls where boards had fallen or blown away, and a section of the roof had caved in on one end, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. But the structure hadn't completely given up. The main post still stood, the basic frame still held together. And Eli could see that with work, a lot of work, it might be salvageable. Fence posts stood at irregular intervals around the property, marking boundaries that had once been clear but were now suggestions rather than solid divisions. Wire hung slack between posts where it remained at all, sagging down to touch the grass in places, completely missing in others. Some posts had rotted through at ground level and fallen, lying in the tall grass like grave markers knocked flat by time and weather. But beneath the ruin and the neglect and the accumulated sorrow of 30 empty years, Eli could see something else. He could see the bones of something that had been built with care and thought and love. The house had been positioned to face east, positioned to catch the morning sun that would warm it through long Montana winters. Someone had planted cottonwoods along the northern edge of the property as a windbreak. They'd grown wild and unkempt now, their branches reaching out in all directions without pruning. But they still stood, still served their purpose, their leaves rustling with a sound like water when the wind moved through them. The barn had been situated with thought, close enough to the house for convenience, but far enough away to keep the smells and sounds of livestock from being intrusive. There was a logic to the layout, a design that spoke of people who'd known what they were doing, who'd understood how land and buildings and weather all worked together. And beyond the buildings, beyond the ruins and the fences and the evidence of human effort, the land itself rolled out in gentle slopes and swells, good grazing land with grass that grew thick where it wasn't overgrown with brush. A creek ran through the eastern boundary. Eli could see the line of darker green that marked its path, could hear the faint sound of running water when he opened his truck door and stepped out into the afternoon air. 60 acres of it, all his now, all waiting for whatever he chose to do with it. Eli climbed out of the truck and stood there as the wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing, as the late afternoon light turned everything golden, as the weight of the moment settled over him. This was it. This was his land, his problem, his possibility. For better or worse, in failure or success, this was where he'd chosen to make his stand. Jasper emerged from the passenger side, shaking himself and then standing still, his nostrils flaring as he took in the new smells, grass and water and old ash, earth and wind and something else, something that might have been promise or might have been warning, depending on how you interpreted it. Well, Eli said aloud, because he'd gotten in the habit of talking to the donkey over the years and saw no reason to stop now. What do you think? Did I just waste our last $3,000, or did I buy us a home? Jasper twitched his ears, forward and back considering, and then moved forward, picking his way carefully toward the leaning barn, his hooves making soft sounds in the grass. Eli followed, and together they began their exploration of what would become either their greatest achievement or their final failure. The barn's interior was a maze of shadows and danger and possibility. Collapsed sections of roof let in shafts of light that illuminated dancing dust motes, making the air inside visible, almost solid-looking in places. The smell was of old hay and rot and time, of wood that had weathered too many seasons without maintenance, of earth and animals and work that had ended decades ago. But some of the structure remained sound. The thick posts that held up the roof were still solid where they hadn't rotted, their bases sunk deep into the ground, their tops still bearing weight. Some of the floor was solid enough to walk on, the boards groaning, but holding under Eli's weight. And in one corner, miraculously, a tack room had survived relatively intact. Its door hung crooked on one remaining hinge, but the small space inside was dry and mostly sound, protected by its position in the corner and by the part of the roof that had held. Eli spent the remaining hours of daylight walking every inch of the property, mapping it in his mind, cataloguing what was there and what was missing, what was salvageable and what was lost forever. He found the old well about 30 yards from where the house had stood, its cover rotted through and collapsed inward, dangerous now, but the stone structure underneath looked intact. With work, it might still provide water. He found what had been a garden, identifiable by the slight mound of the raised beds and by the way the ground lay different there, shaped by human hands for human purpose. It was overgrown now with sage and wild grass and thistles, but the layout was still visible if you knew to look for it. And Eli could imagine it as it had been. Rows of vegetables, maybe some flowers, tended by hands that had believed in the future. He found fence wire tangled in brush, like skeletal fingers reaching up from the ground. He found gateposts still standing, though the gates were long gone, hinges rusted into place, opening onto nothing. He found, scattered around the property, small artifacts that told of the lives that had been lived here. A rusted horseshoe, a bent spoon, bits of pottery and glass worn smooth by weather, a child's marble, green and cloudy, half buried in the dirt near what had been the house, and near where the house had stood. Dominant and undeniable, a stone chimney rose 15 feet into the air, blackened by smoke but solid as the day it was built, pointing at the sky like a marker or a monument or a challenge. Someone had built that with their own hands, had selected and placed each stone, had mixed mortar and laid it true, had stood back when it was done, and felt pride in their work. The building around it was gone. The family that had warmed themselves by its fire was gone, but the stones remained. They had outlasted everything else, and they would outlast Eli too, he thought. But maybe he could build something around them that would last long enough to matter. As darkness began to fall, the long, slow fall of spring evenings, when the light seems to linger forever before finally giving up, Eli made camp. He backed his truck to a spot that was relatively level, dropped the tailgate, and unrolled a sleeping bag that had seen more campsites than he could count or remember. He'd slept in this bag in Montana and Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico, in bunkhouses and under bridges and in the beds of trucks and parking lots, through cold nights and hot ones, through loneliness and occasional contentment. The bag was worn thin in places, patched in others, but it was familiar and comfortable, an old friend that had never let him down. He ate a cold supper, beans straight from the can, bread from Martha's store, water from a jug he'd filled that morning, sharing some grain with Jasper, who'd found a patch of grass to his liking and was grazing with the serious concentration that donkeys bring to eating. The stars came out as they ate, more stars than Eli had seen in years, unobscured by city lights or the glow of towns. Just the pure arch of the Milky Way stretching overhead like a river of light flowing through darkness. Eli lay there in his sleeping bag with Jasper's soft sounds of grazing nearby, looking up at those stars, thinking about what he'd done. $3,000, his entire life savings, the complete accumulation of 40 years of work, spent on land everyone said was cursed, on buildings that were mostly memory, on a dream that had failed for everyone who'd tried it. A reasonable man would have kept driving. A smart man would have asked for his money back while he still could, would have been in Tom Ridley's office first thing in the morning, demanding a refund. But Eli had learned, over the course of 60 years and more mistakes than he cared to count, that he wasn't always reasonable, and he certainly wasn't always smart. What he was, though, what he'd always been, even when it would have been easier to be otherwise, was determined. Stubborn, some people called it, and they probably weren't wrong. But stubbornness had kept him going through hard times before, and it would keep him going now. The land didn't care about his failures or his regrets. It didn't judge him for the marriage he'd ruined through his inability to stay put, for the daughter he'd failed to raise, for the years he'd wasted drifting from place to place without ever building anything that lasted. The land simply was, waiting, patient as only Earth can be patient, ready for someone willing to do the work of making it into something more than just empty acres. Tomorrow he'd start. He'd clear debris and sort salvage and begin the slow, methodical process of building something from nothing. It wouldn't be easy. He was under no illusions about that. The work would be hard, maybe harder than anything he'd done before, and he wasn't a young man anymore. His back would complain, his joints would ache, his muscles would remind him of his age with every shovel of dirt and every board lifted. But easy wasn't what he needed. Easy hadn't gotten him anywhere in 60 years. Maybe hard was exactly what he needed. Maybe the only way to build something that mattered was to put everything he had left into it. As sleep began to take him, pulling him down into darkness deeper than the Montana night, Eli's last conscious thought was of the stone chimney standing alone against the sky. Someone had built that with their own hands, had done the work even knowing it was hard, even knowing that nothing lasts forever. That someone was gone now, their name forgotten by most, their efforts reduced to ruins, but the stones remained. Blackened and empty and surrounded by ashes, yes, but still standing, still pointing upward. Still marking the place where people had lived and loved and tried to build something worth having. Eli would do the same. He'd build again on this ground where others had built and failed. He'd try again where others had tried and lost. And maybe he'd fail too. Probably he would, if history and local reputation were any guide. But the trying mattered. The building mattered. The work of taking what was broken and making it whole again mattered. Even if it didn't last, even if it ended in failure like so many other things in his life had ended. Tomorrow, he'd start. Tonight, he'd sleep under stars that had witnessed countless human efforts, countless failures and successes, countless lives lived in the space between hope and surrender. The stars didn't care which way it went for him, any more than the land cared. But he cared. And caring, he was beginning to understand, might be enough. Not to guarantee success, but to make the trying worthwhile. Jasper settled down in the grass nearby, his breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. And Eli Boone, 60 years old and down to his last dollar, slept the deep sleep of someone who'd finally found a place to rest. Even if that place was nothing but ash and ruins and 60 acres of grass. The first light of morning found Eli already awake, had found him awake for the better part of an hour, lying in his sleeping bag, watching the sky change from black to deep blue to the pale translucent color that comes just before sunrise. He'd always been an early riser, a habit formed over decades of ranch work where dawn meant the start of the workday, and sleeping late meant someone else had already done the morning chores. Old habits were hard to break, even when there was no one expecting him to be anywhere. Even when he could sleep as late as he wanted and answer to no one but himself. He made coffee on his camp stove, a battered single-burner propane rig that had traveled with him for 20 years. The smell of coffee brewing was one of life's reliable pleasures, unchanged by circumstance or location. It smelled the same here, on this burned-out ranch in Montana, as it had in New Mexico or Wyoming, or any of the dozen other places he'd made coffee over the years. There was comfort in that continuity, in the simple ritual of measuring grounds and water, of waiting for the percolator to bubble, of pouring that first cup and wrapping cold hands around its warmth. He drank his coffee, standing at the tailgate of his truck, looking out over his property in the morning light, seeing it fresh and clear and full of possibility, despite the obvious challenges. The ruins looked less forbidding in daylight, more like a project to be tackled than a monument to failure. The leaning barn looked salvageable rather than hopeless. The overgrown grass looked like it could be cleared rather than like it had won some final victory over human effort. Jasper emerged from wherever he'd wandered during the night, ambling over with the unhurried gait that suggested he'd already had a good breakfast of grass and was ready to see what the day would bring. The donkey had a gift for living in the present moment that Eli envied. Jasper never worried about tomorrow, never regretted yesterday, never seemed to carry the weight of accumulated failures and missed opportunities. He was here now, and that was enough. Eli wished he could approach life with the same simple acceptance. "All right, old friend," Eli said, setting down his empty coffee cup. "Time to get to work. We've got ourselves a ranch to build, and neither of us is getting any younger. Better make the most of the time we have." The work he chose to start with was the kind that any building project requires, but that nobody thinks about until they're deep into it. Clearing away the debris, sorting through what could be saved and what had to be discarded, making space for the actual construction that would come later. It was unglamorous work, dirty and tedious and necessary, the kind of work that builds calluses and tests patience, but that has to be done before anything else can happen. Eli started with the debris field where the house had been, working methodically from one corner and moving across in careful lines, not wanting to miss anything or leave dangerous hazards buried in the ash. He worked with gloves and a shovel and a wheelbarrow that had seen better days but still rolled, more or less, when pushed. The process was archaeological in its way. Each layer of debris told a story about the house that had stood here, about the life that had been lived within its walls. The top layer was all modern materials from the 1980s and early 1990s, bits of vinyl siding melted and twisted by heat, fragments of fiberglass insulation, the metal remains of window frames, pieces of the satellite dish that had probably been the Brennan's connection to the world beyond Ashford. Below that was older material from earlier renovations or additions, wood siding that had been painted and repainted over decades, window frames made of real wood instead of aluminum, remnants of linoleum flooring that had been popular in the 1960s, and at the very bottom, under everything that had been added later, was the original construction, hand-hewn timbers, real plaster instead of drywall, wooden lath, hand-forged nails that were square instead of round, artifacts from a time when building a house meant working with hand tools and muscle power and skills that had been passed down through generations. Eli worked steadily through the morning, creating piles as he went, metal to sell for scrap, because even rusted and twisted, it had value to someone with a foundry or a recycling operation. Wood that might still be useful for something, boards that weren't too badly burned or rotted, and the broken remnants fit only for burning, the stuff that was too far gone to salvage, but that still needed to be cleared away before anything new could be built. It was hard work, harder than he'd expected, and by mid-morning his back was reminding him that he was 60 years old, not 30. That his body had been worked hard for decades and didn't recover as quickly as it once had. But there was something deeply satisfying about it too. Every shovel of debris cleared, every piece of twisted metal removed, every board stacked in the salvage pile was progress, visible and undeniable. He could look back at the end of an hour and see the difference his work had made. That kind of immediate, tangible result was something he'd missed in the last few years of drifting from job to job, of doing work that disappeared into the general operation of someone else's ranch, of never seeing the long-term results of his effort. Jasper proved himself to be more than just a companion. When Eli rigged up a simple harness using rope and some leather straps he'd had in the truck, the donkey took to pulling the loaded wheelbarrow with only minimal complaint. The work relationship they'd developed over 8 years paid off now. Jasper understood what was being asked of him, and while he had his stubborn moments, because a donkey wouldn't be a donkey without stubbornness, he did his part with a consistency that Eli appreciated. They worked together in a rhythm that required few words, each understanding his role, each contributing what he could. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the heat made hard physical labor dangerous for a man of Eli's age, they'd rest in the shade of the truck while Jasper grazed. Eli would eat whatever simple food he'd brought, canned soup, bread and peanut butter, an apple if he had one. And he'd think about what he was doing here, why he'd made this choice, what he hoped to accomplish with whatever time he had left. It was during one of these afternoon rest periods, 3 weeks into the work, that Eli found the locket. He'd been clearing what appeared to be the remains of a bedroom, identifiable by the rusted springs of a bed frame that had partially survived the fire, and by the melted glass that had once been a window, now fused into strange shapes by the heat. The ash here was deeper than in other parts of the foundation, compressed and hardened by years of weather, and his shovel had to work to break through it. He was digging carefully, trying not to damage anything that might be salvageable, when he heard a sound different from the usual scrape of metal on ash and wood, a kind of clink that suggested metal on metal. Eli stopped immediately and knelt down, suddenly careful, suddenly aware that he'd found something. He brushed away the debris with his gloved hand, working slowly and gently, and there it was, a small object made of metal, blackened by fire and tarnished by time but intact. Still holding its shape after 3 decades in the ashes, he picked it up carefully, holding it in his palm, studying it there in the afternoon light. It was a locket, heart-shaped, the kind of thing that had been popular in earlier decades, the kind of jewelry that was given as a gift and kept forever. The outside was badly tarnished, so blackened by the fire that he couldn't tell what color the metal was supposed to be, but the shape was clear, and the basic structure was sound. The clasp that held it closed was stuck, fused by heat or rust or time. Eli carried it to the truck like he was carrying something precious, which he supposed he was. He kept a bucket of water for washing up, and he used it now to begin cleaning the locket, working gently with a soft rag and patience. The cleaning took time, took the better part of an hour as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the light began to change toward evening. Slowly as he worked, the ash and grime washed away, revealing tarnished silver underneath. It was a good piece of work, he could see now, well made and solid. The kind of thing that was built to last and meant to be treasured. The clasp resisted his efforts to open it, and Eli was afraid of forcing it, afraid of breaking whatever was inside. He worked it carefully, applying gentle pressure, working oil from his truck's maintenance kit into the mechanism, letting it sit and then trying again. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the clasp gave way with a small click that sounded loud in the evening quiet. Inside, protected by the sealed case, was a photograph. The image had faded with time, the colors having long since given way to browns and grays and sepia tones, but it was still clear enough to see. A young couple stared out from the past, she in a dress with a modest collar and her hair styled in the fashion of another era, he in a white shirt with suspenders and his hair neatly combed, both of them wearing expressions of hope and joy, and something that might have been love or might have been simple happiness at having their picture taken. Behind them, barely visible but definitely there, was the outline of a house. Not a ruined house, not a burned house, but a complete house, with walls and roof and windows that caught the light. This house, Eli realized with a sudden tightening in his chest. This house before the fire, before the tragedy, before time and bad luck had reduced it to the ashes he'd been sifting through. He turned the locket over in his hands, looking for any other details, and found engraved on the back in script so small he had to squint to read it. E and R, forever. 1958, E and R. The initials of 2 people whose names were lost to him, but whose love, or at least whose intention of love, whose promise of forever, had been important enough to engrave in silver, to preserve in a locket that would be carried close to the heart. 1958. That was 67 years ago, nearly 7 decades in the past. These people, whoever they were, would be old now if they were still alive. Maybe in their 80s or 90s. Maybe dead, almost certainly gone from this place that they'd once called home. Eli sat in the bed of his truck, the locket open in his hands, the photograph of the young couple staring up at him from their distant past, and felt something shift in his chest. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name, part sorrow for lives interrupted, part connection to these strangers whose hopes were preserved in silver, part recognition that he wasn't the first person to stand on this land and imagine building a future here. This wasn't just land and lumber he was working with. These ruins represented lives lived, promises made, dreams built with calloused hands and hopeful hearts, just like his own. He and whoever they were, had stood where he was standing. They'd looked at this land and seen possibility. They'd made plans and worked hard and believed in tomorrow. What had happened to them? What had turned their forever into these ashes? That evening, after he'd eaten and checked on Jasper and watched the sun set over the Montana hills, Eli made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd drive back to Ashford and ask Martha what she knew about the history of this place. The locket was a clue to something, a thread that might lead to a story. And if he was going to rebuild this ranch, if he was going to pour his last years and his last dollars into making something rise from these ruins, he wanted to know whose work he was continuing, whose dreams he was honoring, whose forever he was trying to make real again. He placed the locket carefully on the dashboard of his truck, where the morning sun would catch it, where he could see it every day and remember that this place had a history deeper than the fire that had destroyed it. E&R Elijah and Rose, maybe, or Edward and Ruth, or any number of other names that started with those letters. But whoever they were, their love, their belief in forever, deserved to be remembered, deserved to be honored, deserved to have someone know their story. That night, as Eli lay in his sleeping bag with the stars wheeling overhead and Jasper's soft breathing nearby, he found himself thinking about permanence and loss, about love and time, about the human need to build things that will last beyond our own brief years on Earth. The locket had changed something for him, had shifted his understanding of what he was doing here from a personal quest for belonging to something larger. Something that connected him to the past and to the future, and to all the other people who had tried to build lives in this hard, beautiful country. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it came, it was filled with dreams of people he'd never met, of a young couple standing in front of a house that didn't exist anymore, of promises whispered and sealed with silver, of forever proving to be more temporary than anyone expected, but no less real for its brevity. The morning after finding the locket, Eli rose with the sun and drove straight to Ashford, leaving Jasper to graze and rest. The town looked exactly as it had during his first visit 3 weeks ago. Nothing had changed, which was probably the way things went here, year after year, decade after decade. Ashford was a place where change came slowly if it came at all, where the rhythms of life were measured in seasons rather than days, where history accumulated like sediment instead of being constantly swept away by the new. Martha was opening up her store when he arrived, unlocking the door and flipping the sign from closed to open. She looked surprised to see him, but not displeased, and there was something in her expression that might have been approval, as if his survival for 3 weeks qualified him for some kind of provisional acceptance. "Mr. Boone," she said by way of greeting. "You're still alive, then. That's something. Most folks don't make it past the first week out there before they decide the place isn't for them." "Still alive," Eli agreed, "and likely to stay that way for a while yet. But I need some information, Mrs. Henley, if you're willing to share it." She invited him in, the bell above the door announcing their entrance, and led him to the small table near the window where they'd sat during his first visit. The coffee pot was already on, filling the store with its welcoming aroma, and she poured 2 cups without asking, settling into her chair with the air of someone preparing to hear a long story. Eli showed her the locket, opening it carefully to reveal the photograph inside, turning it over to show the inscription on the back. Martha held it gently, her rough hands surprisingly delicate as she studied the silver heart, and something in her face softened as she looked at the young couple's faces. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In the ashes where the house used to stand." It was buried pretty deep, like it had been in a dresser or something that collapsed during the fire. but it survived somehow, protected by the case. The photographs faded, but still clear enough to see. Martha continued to study the locket, her expression thoughtful, her eyes seeing something beyond the present moment. "That's not the Brennans," she said finally. "They would have been in their 30s when they died, and this photograph is much older than that. Look at the clothing, the way the photograph itself looks. This is from the 50s or early 60s, I'd guess. And the inscription, 1958. That would be the original builders, I imagine. The Mercers, you knew them?" "No, not directly. I was just a girl then, maybe 7 or 8 years old when they built that ranch, and my family lived in Billings. We didn't move to Ashford until I was a teenager, after my father bought the grain elevator. But I know the name from the land records, from property tax files, from the kind of information that accumulates in a town like this over the years. And I've heard stories from people who did know them." She handed the locket back to Eli, but her eyes were still seeing the past, reaching back across decades to a time she'd only experienced secondhand, through other people's memories. "Elijah and Rose Mercer. That's what I've heard them called, though I can't swear that those are their real names. They were the ones who originally built that ranch, back in the late 50s. Came here with nothing but hope and determination and each other. Young, couldn't have been more than mid-20s when they started. They bought that land when it was nothing but grass and sky, no buildings, no improvements, just raw acres that nobody else wanted because it was too far from town. Too isolated, too hard to make work." Martha paused, sipping her coffee, organizing her thoughts. "The stories I've heard paint them as workers, both of them, not afraid of hard labor, not looking for easy success. They started with a tent, lived on the land while they built, him doing day labor for other ranches to earn money for materials, her working whatever jobs she could find in town. Took them 3 years to build that house, working weekends and evenings and any other time they could spare. Built it themselves mostly, him doing the heavy work, her helping however she could, both of them learning as they went. It said they'd drive to other ranches and ask questions, learn from older folks who'd been building in this country for decades, take advice seriously, and apply it carefully." "What happened to them?" Eli asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "People who built ranches with their own hands and engraved forever in silver lockets didn't usually walk away willingly." But Martha shook her head. "They didn't die in the fire, if that's what you're thinking. That fire was 30 years later in 1994. The Mercers were long gone by then." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The stories say they lost the ranch in the mid-60s. 65, maybe 66. I don't know the details, whether it was drought or debt or bad luck or all of those things together, but they couldn't keep it. They sold it and moved away. Billings, I think someone said, though I can't be certain. Elijah found work in construction, used the skills he'd learned building his own place to earn a living building for other people. As far as I know, they never came back." Eli thought about that, about what it must have meant to build something with your own hands over years of hard work, to pour your hope and youth and strength into making a home and then to lose it anyway, to have to walk away from forever with only a few years to show for all that effort. The loss would have been staggering, the heartbreak almost unimaginable. "Do you know if they're still alive?" he asked. "No idea," Martha admitted. "That was 60 years ago. They'd have been in their 20s then, which would make them in their 80s or 90s now, if they survived. But I've got no way of knowing. People lose track of each other over decades, especially in a big place like Montana, where you can drive 8 hours and still be in the same state. Is there anyone who might remember them? Anyone who was here in the 50s and 60s who might know more?" Martha thought for a moment, drumming her fingers on the table. "Old Pete might. He's been in this area forever. Grew up on a ranch about 15 miles south of here, worked in these parts his whole life, except for a stint in Korea back in the early 50s. If anyone would remember the Mercers, it'd be him. You'll find him at the diner most mornings, sitting in the same booth he's been sitting in for the last 40 years. Eli thanked her and bought a few supplies he actually needed. Coffee, canned goods, rope, to replace the sections that were too worn, and then made his way to the diner. It wasn't hard to find old Pete. Just as Martha had said, he was in a corner booth, ancient and weathered, like a piece of driftwood left too long in the sun, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and a newspaper that looked like it was several days old. He had the kind of face that told you he'd lived through things most people only read about, had endured and persisted and kept going when easier men would have quit. Eli bought himself a cup of coffee and approached the booth. "Excuse me, sir. My name's Eli Boone. Martha Henley said you might be willing to talk to me about some history around here." Pete looked up, his eyes still sharp despite his age, and gestured to the bench across from him. "Sit down, then. You're the fellow who bought the old Mercer place, aren't you? Word gets around in a town this size. People are taking bets on how long you'll last. Most don't have you making it past summer. They might be right," Eli admitted, "but I'm going to try anyway. I found something out there, and I'm trying to understand what it means, where it came from." He showed Pete the locket, explaining where he'd found it, showing him the photograph and the inscription. The old man held the silver heart in his gnarled hands with surprising gentleness, studying the faces in the photograph with an expression that might have been recognition, or might have been sadness, or might have been both. "Elijah and Rose," Pete said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memory and time. "Good people, young, strong as bull elks, both of them, and just about as stubborn. Built that ranch from nothing. I mean truly nothing. When they started, there wasn't even a road in there, just a track through the grass. They'd drive their beat-up Ford truck as far as they could, then walk the last mile, carrying supplies on their backs. He was a ranch hand, working for the Johnsons, over on the east side of the county, and she was waitressing at a place that's been closed for 30 years now. They saved every penny, lived in a tiny apartment in town that probably wasn't fit for much more than storage, ate beans and bread for dinner most nights. But they had a plan, had a vision of what they wanted to build." Pete paused, sipping his coffee, and Eli had the sense that the old man was seeing things that weren't in the diner, was watching a past that existed only in his memory now. There was something to see, those two. The way they'd look at each other, you knew they were building more than just a house. They were building a life, building a family, building something they thought would last forever. And for a while, it looked like they might actually make it work. "What happened?" Eli asked. "Same thing that happens to a lot of folks out here," Pete said. And there was a profound sadness in his voice. The sadness of someone who'd seen too many dreams fail, too many good people lose fights they couldn't win. "The land is beautiful, but it's hard. Really hard. Not everybody understands that until they're too deep in to back out gracefully. The Mercers worked themselves near to death, and for the first few years, it seemed like that might be enough. They got cattle, built up a small herd, had some good years. They had a little girl too, Margaret, I think her name was. Sweet kid. You'd see her in town sometimes, riding in the back of their truck, waving at everyone like she owned the world." Pete's expression grew more somber. But then things started going wrong. Drought in 63 hit them hard, lost half their cattle that year. Beef prices dropped in 64, and what cattle they had left weren't worth as much as they needed them to be. Elijah took work where he could find it to bring in cash, but that meant he wasn't on the ranch doing the work that needed doing, which meant things fell behind, which meant more problems piled up. "It's a cycle that's hard to break out of once you're in it. They lost it," Eli said. "It wasn't a question. They lost it," Pete confirmed. "Sold in 65, or maybe it was early 66. I remember seeing them load up their truck with what little they had, driving away with that look on their faces, like they'd fought as hard as they could, and it still hadn't been enough. Broke my heart, honestly. They'd put everything into that place, their youth, their strength, their hopes, and they had to walk away with less than they'd started with, carrying the weight of failure on their shoulders. Do you know what happened to them after? Moved to Billings, like a lot of folks do when the ranch life doesn't work out. Elijah got work in construction. Ironic, really, using the skills he'd developed, building his own place to build things for other people. I heard he did well at it, made a decent living. But I also heard he never talked about the ranch, never mentioned those years, like they were something he needed to forget in order to keep going forward. Can't say I blame him for that. Are they still alive? Eli asked the question he'd asked Martha, hoping for a different answer, hoping for some thread he could follow. Pete shook his head slowly. Elijah passed away in the early 80s, as I recall. Heart attack, sudden and quick. He was in his 50s, too young really. But he'd worked hard all his life and maybe it caught up with him. Rose lived longer. I heard she made it into the late 80s or early 90s, but I don't know for sure. The girl, Margaret, she'd be your age now, early 60s. No idea where she ended up or what kind of life she built for herself. The Mercers just kind of disappeared into history, became another story of people who tried and failed, another cautionary tale about the risks of ranching in hard country. Eli sat there absorbing this information, fitting it together with what he knew, with what he'd found, with what he was trying to build. Elijah and Rose, young and hopeful and doomed by circumstances beyond their control. They'd built the ranch he was now trying to rebuild, had stood where he'd stood, had looked at the same land and seen the same possibilities. Their dream had lasted less than a decade. How long would his last? "Thank you," he said to Pete, standing and offering his hand. "I appreciate you telling me their story. It helps to know whose work I'm continuing, whose foundation I'm building on." Pete shook his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for such an old man. "You planning to rebuild out there? To actually make something of that place?" "I'm going to try. Good luck to you, son. If anyone can do it, maybe it's someone who knows what he's getting into, someone who's heard the warnings and decided to try anyway. The Mercers deserved better than what they got. Maybe you can give their dream a second chance, even if they're not here to see it." Eli drove back to the ranch with the locket on the seat beside him. Elijah and Rose's faces staring up from their photograph. They're forever reduced to a story told by old men in diners. But they'd been real, had loved and worked and tried with everything they had. And now their story was woven into his, their efforts becoming part of his purpose, their dreams giving weight and meaning to his own attempt. That night, as Eli lay in his sleeping bag, with Jasper snoring softly nearby, he found himself talking to them, to Elijah and Rose, wherever they were now, whether they still lived or had passed on to whatever came after this life. "I found your locket," he said aloud, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind in the cottonwoods. "Found it in the ashes where your house used to stand. I'm going to rebuild it, the house, the barn, the ranch. I'm going to finish what you started, honor the work you did. I can't promise I'll succeed where you failed, can't guarantee I'll do any better, but I promise I'll try. I promise I'll remember you were here, that you built this place with love and hope." That has to count for something. It has to mean something that you tried, even if the trying wasn't enough. The wind was his only answer, moving through the grass with a sound like breathing, like the land itself responding to his promise. Eli took it as agreement, as blessing, as whatever comfort he could find in the vast Montana night. He slept, holding the locket, feeling its weight in his hand, carrying forward the dreams of people he'd never met, but who he felt he knew better than most people he'd actually encountered in his 60 years of life. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, he was not alone. He was connected to the past, to the history of this place, to all the people who had tried to build something lasting in this hard, beautiful country. And that connection, he was beginning to understand, might be the most important thing he'd found in the ashes, more valuable than salvaged lumber, more necessary than good tools, more essential than even the land itself. The locket sat on his dashboard now, catching the first light of morning, a daily reminder of whose work he was continuing, whose dreams he was trying to make real again, whose forever he was honoring with every board he lifted and every nail he drove. The days that followed found Eli settling into a rhythm that was as old as work itself, as timeless as the cycle of sunrise and sunset that governed life on the land. Wake with the dawn, make coffee on the camp stove, eat a simple breakfast of oatmeal or bread or whatever was quick and filling, and then begin the day's labor. The work was endless in its variety, but consistent in its demands, always physical, always challenging, always testing the limits of what one aging man and one stubborn donkey could accomplish in a day. He continued clearing the debris field where the house had been, working methodically, treating it like the archaeological dig it had become in his mind. Each layer revealed something new, some artifact or detail that added to his understanding of the lives that had been lived here. He found pieces of a child's tea set, the tiny cups and saucers miraculously intact despite the fire's heat. He found buttons, dozens of them scattered through the ash like seeds, buttons from shirts and dresses and coats, each one a small piece of the clothing that had filled closets and drawers in a house that no longer existed. He found coins, mostly pennies, their copper darkened by heat but still recognizable, small change that had been kept in jars or fallen between cushions or rolled under furniture. He found the metal frame of reading glasses, twisted by heat but still identifiable. Still speaking of someone who'd sat in this house reading books or newspapers by lamplight. Each discovery felt sacred somehow. Felt like he was handling pieces of lives that deserved to be remembered. He started keeping the more significant items in a box in his truck, the tea set, an old pocket knife with a bone handle, a wedding ring, not the one from the locket, but another, probably belonging to one of the later families, a small metal car that had been a child's toy. These weren't his to keep exactly, but they were too meaningful to simply throw away. Maybe someday he'd find out who they belonged to, who they would matter to. Maybe they'd be a way of connecting the past to the present, of honoring the people who'd come before. The barn became his focus once the worst of the house debris was cleared. The structure was more salvageable than he'd initially thought, which was good, because building a new barn from scratch would have been beyond his budget and probably beyond his physical capabilities. The main posts were solid, massive timbers that had been sunk deep into the ground decades ago, timbers that had been selected for strength and straightness, that had been placed with care and precision. The frame was sound in most places, though some of the crossbeams had rotted and would need to be replaced. The roof was the biggest problem. Large sections had collapsed or blown away, and what remained was questionable at best. But it was workable. With time and effort and careful application of what materials he had or could afford to buy, Eli could make the barn functional again. It wouldn't be pretty, wouldn't look like something out of a magazine, but it would serve its purpose. It would provide shelter for Jasper, storage for hay and supplies, space to work when weather made outside labor impossible. That was enough. It was during this phase of work, while he was clearing out the accumulated debris inside the barn, that Jasper began acting strangely. The donkey had been remarkably consistent in his habits over the 8 years they'd been together, and Eli had learned to pay attention when Jasper deviated from his normal routines. So when the animal kept returning to the barn, kept pawing at a particular spot on the floor with unusual insistence, kept braying in a way that seemed designed to get Eli's attention, Eli finally stopped what he was doing and paid attention. "What is it, old friend?" he asked, kneeling down to examine the spot where Jasper was so insistently pawing. "What have you found?" The boards here looked different from the others, Eli realized, as he studied them more carefully. They were newer. Not new, but newer than the surrounding floor, installed at a different time or for a different purpose. And they weren't nailed down the same way the other boards were. They were designed to be lifted, to be removed, and replaced. Eli retrieved a crowbar from the tool collection he'd been accumulating and carefully pried up the boards. Beneath was a space deliberately created, hollowed out between the floor joists. And in that space was a metal box, the kind designed to protect important documents from fire and water. The kind you buried when you wanted things to survive beyond your own uncertain future. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the box out. It was heavy, sealed tight, its surface spotted with rust, but its integrity intact. He carried it outside into the afternoon light and sat down on a stump he'd been meaning to split for firewood. The box resting on his knees like a treasure chest from some story of pirates and buried gold. The seal resisted his efforts to break it, and Eli was glad for that resistance because it meant whatever was inside had been well protected, had survived 3 decades without being compromised by moisture or vermin, or the natural decay that affects all things given enough time. He worked at it carefully, not wanting to force anything, not wanting to damage whatever precious contents might be inside. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the seal gave way with a sound like a long-held breath being released. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas that had done its job of protecting against moisture and time, were papers, letters, and a book, a diary or journal, its cover worn leather, its pages filled with careful handwriting that was immediately recognizable as feminine. The letters formed with care and precision, and the kind of attention that suggested the writer knew these words mattered, that they were meant to last. Eli opened the diary with the kind of reverence he might have brought to handling a Bible or some other sacred text. The first page bore an inscription in the same careful handwriting, Rose Mercer, 1958. His breath caught in his throat. This was her diary. The R from the locket, the Rose that Pete had spoken about, the woman who'd stood beside Elijah and built this ranch from nothing. Her private thoughts, her daily experiences, her hopes and fears and observations about the life she was building, all of it preserved in this book that had been hidden away for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, but would surely discover as he read. He began to read there in the fading afternoon light, and as he did, the ranch's past came alive around him, became as real and present as the grass and wind and sky that surrounded him now. The entries started on Rose's wedding day. Her handwriting was especially careful here, especially neat, as if she understood that this was a moment worth recording well, worth preserving in the best form she could manage. "Married my Elijah today," she'd written. "We're so poor we could barely afford the license, had to borrow the money from his brother, and we'll have to pay it back over the next 6 months. But we're rich in hope, rich in determination, rich in love for each other and for the life we're planning to build. He promised me we'd build something together, something that would last, something we could be proud of. I believe him because I have to, because we've got nothing else to build our future on, except our own hands and hearts and the strength of our commitment. He's got strong hands and a good heart. What else does a person need?" The entries that followed documented their struggles to scrape together enough money to buy the land. Rose wrote about working double shifts at the diner, about Elijah taking any job he could find, ranch work, construction, hauling, anything that paid even a little. She wrote about living in their tiny apartment and learning to cook meals from almost nothing, about making do with clothes that were worn and patched, about sacrificing every comfort and convenience so they could save toward their dream. There was no complaint in her writing, no bitterness about the sacrifices they were making. Instead, there was determination and hope and a kind of joy in the shared struggle, in the knowledge that they were working toward something together. "We did it," she'd written in an entry dated April 1957. "We finally did it. After 2 years of saving every penny, of going without everything except the bare necessities, of working ourselves to exhaustion, we finally have enough. We bought 60 acres today. 60 acres that are ours, that belong to us, that we'll never have to leave if we don't choose to. The land is beautiful, rolling and green with good grass and a creek running through it. There are no buildings yet, no improvements at all, just raw land waiting for us to make something of it. But when Elijah and I stood there today, looking at our property, I felt like the richest woman in Montana. This is ours. This is where we'll build our life, raise our children, grow old together. This is home, even though there's nothing there yet but grass and sky and possibility." Subsequent entries documented the building process, the slow, painstaking work of creating something from nothing. They'd started with a tent, living on the land throughout the summer and fall of 1957 while they worked on the house. Elijah had salvaged materials wherever he could, trading his labor for lumber, learning carpentry skills from older ranchers who took pity on the young couple and offered advice, along with whatever boards or nails they could spare. Rose wrote about the physical challenges of living in a tent, about cold nights and wet mornings and insects and the constant worry that winter would come before they had proper shelter. But she also wrote about the satisfaction of watching the house take shape, of seeing walls rise where there had been only stakes and string, of walking through door frames that defined rooms that didn't yet have roofs or floors. The house is starting to look like a house, one entry read. 4 walls are up now and windows are framed in. Still no roof, but Elijah says he'll have it on before the first snow. I believe him because he's never broken a promise to me, not once. The work is hard, harder than anything I've ever done, but it's good work. My hands have blisters and my back aches at the end of each day, but I fall asleep knowing that what we built today will still be there tomorrow, that we're creating something real and solid and permanent. Margaret is due in December, and I won't have my baby born in a tent. Elijah knows this, and I can see him pushing himself harder because of it, working longer hours, accepting more pain and exhaustion, because he wants to give his daughter a proper home to be born into. Margaret. Their daughter. Eli turned pages carefully, finding entries about her birth, about the challenges and joys of new parenthood, about the deep satisfaction of bringing a child into a home you'd built with your own hands. Margaret Rose Mercer came into the world at 3:47 this morning, Rose had written in December 1960. 7 pounds, 6 ounces of perfect, healthy baby. Elijah cried when he held her for the first time. I've never seen him cry before, not through all the hardships we've faced. But he held our daughter, and tears just streamed down his face, and he said, "We did it, Rosie. We built something that will last." And I knew he wasn't just talking about the house or the ranch. He was talking about this, about our family, about the life we're creating, about the future we're giving to this little girl who's sleeping in my arms as I write this. The entries continued through 1961 and into 1962, documenting the ongoing work of building a life on the ranch, of raising cattle and growing hay, and learning the 1,000 skills that successful ranching required. Rose wrote about good years and hard years, about seasons when everything went right and seasons when nothing did, about the constant challenge of staying ahead of expenses, of making enough to live on and save a little for the future. Through it all, her love for Elijah and for their life together came through in every line, in every observation, in every reflection on their circumstances. But then, slowly, the tone began to change. The entries from late 1962 and into 1963 grew shorter, less detailed, touched with worry that hadn't been present in the earlier writing. Money troubles, drought affecting the grass and therefore the cattle, prices dropping at exactly the wrong time, Elijah working longer hours, taking jobs off the ranch to bring in cash, which meant he wasn't home doing the work that needed doing on their own place. I'm scared, Rose had written in June 1963. I haven't said that out loud to Elijah, haven't wanted to add to the burden he's already carrying. But I'm writing it here because I need to acknowledge it somewhere. We're losing ground. Despite all our work, all our sacrifice, all our determination, we're losing ground. The drought has been terrible, and we've lost half our cattle. The ones we have left aren't bringing good prices because everyone else is selling too, flooding the market with beef from dying herds. Elijah is working construction 3 days a week in town, just to keep us afloat, which means the ranch work is falling behind, which creates more problems. I don't know how this ends. I don't know how we break out of this cycle. I'm trying to stay hopeful, trying to believe we'll find a way through. But some nights I lie awake listening to Elijah's breathing beside me and wondering if love and hard work are really enough. The entries from 1964 and early 1965 were increasingly sparse and increasingly painful to read. The financial situation had become dire. Rose wrote about arguments with Elijah, their first real conflicts in their years together, about pride and asking for help, about whether to keep fighting or to cut their losses while they still could. She wrote about Elijah's increasing exhaustion, about how he was working himself to death trying to save the ranch, about her fear that they would lose him before they lost the land. The final entries. from February and March of 1965 documented the decision that must have broken their hearts. The decision to sell, the agony of accepting that love and work weren't always enough, that sometimes circumstances beyond your control could defeat even the strongest determination. The arrangements to move to Billings, where Elijah had been offered steady work in construction. The preparations for leaving behind everything they'd built. The last entry, dated March 15, 1965, was brief and devastating in its simplicity. "We're leaving tomorrow. I can't write anymore. My heart is too full of everything I can't say. We built this place with our hands and hearts, poured ourselves into every board and nail, believed with everything we had that it would last forever. But forever is shorter than we thought. Tomorrow we drive away from our dream, and I don't know how we'll ever recover from this loss. I'm hiding this diary because I can't bear to throw it away, but I can't bear to carry it with us either. Maybe someday, long after we're gone, someone will find it and know that we were here, that we tried, that we loved this place, even though we couldn't keep it. That has to count for something." Eli sat there as the sun moved across the sky, as afternoon became evening, as shadows lengthened and the light began to fade. He'd been reading for hours, absorbed completely in Rose's voice, living through her hopes and heartbreaks, experiencing the rise and fall of her dreams as if they were his own. When he finally looked up, tears were running down his face. The first tears he'd cried in, longer than he could remember, tears he hadn't known he was capable of anymore. These people had been real. They'd loved and worked and sacrificed and tried with everything they had, and they'd lost. Not because they were weak or foolish or inadequate, but because sometimes the world is hard and luck runs out, and circumstances conspire against even the strongest efforts. Their story wasn't unique. Thousands of families had faced similar struggles, had made similar choices, had walked away from dreams they couldn't sustain. But their story was particular, was specific to this land and this house and these people who'd believed in forever, and had their forever cut short after less than a decade. That night, after he'd carefully placed the diary back in the metal box and stored it safely in his truck, after he'd checked on Jasper and eaten a simple supper and watched the sun set over land that had witnessed so much human effort and heartbreak, Eli found himself talking to Elijah and Rose again, addressing people who were probably dead, but who felt more alive to him now than most people he'd actually met. "I read your diary. Rose," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty acres. "I read about how you built this place, about how hard you worked, about how much you loved Elijah and Margaret and this land. I read about how you lost it despite doing everything right, despite giving it everything you had. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry the world was so hard. Sorry that trying wasn't enough. Sorry that you had to walk away from your forever." He paused, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods, to the sound of Jasper moving in the grass, to the vast quiet of the Montana night. "But I want you to know, I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to rebuild this house, restore this barn, make this ranch work again. I can't promise I'll succeed where you failed. I can't guarantee I'll do any better. But I promise I'll honor your work, remember your effort, carry forward your dream. You deserve that much. You deserve to be remembered, to have your story told, to know that what you built here mattered, even though it didn't last as long as you hoped." The wind was his only answer, but Eli took comfort in it anyway. Rose's diary had changed something for him, had deepened his understanding of what he was doing here from a personal quest for belonging to something larger and more significant. He wasn't just building a home for himself. He was honoring the dreams of people who'd tried and failed, preserving the memory of love and work and determination that deserved to be remembered. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, he was connected to Elijah and Rose, to their daughter Margaret, to all the accumulated hopes of people who'd tried to build lives in this hard, beautiful place. And that connection, he was beginning to understand, was as essential to the success of his own efforts as good lumber or strong tools or sufficient funds. He placed Rose's diary on his dashboard next to the locket, Two artifacts from the same vanished life. Two pieces of evidence that Elijah and Rose Mercer had lived and loved and tried to build forever, in a place where forever proved shorter than they'd hoped, but their story wasn't finished yet. As long as Eli kept building, kept working, kept honoring their memory, their dream lived on. And maybe, he thought, as he finally settled into his sleeping bag under the vast arch of stars, maybe that was enough. Maybe the trying mattered more than the succeeding, and the remembering mattered most of all. He fell asleep, holding the locket in one hand, and thinking about a young couple who'd stood on this same ground decades ago, looking at the same stars, believing in forever with all their hearts. They'd been wrong about forever lasting, but they'd been right about trying. And that was the lesson he'd carry forward into tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. That trying mattered. That building mattered. That loving something enough to pour yourself into it mattered. Even if, especially if, the outcome was uncertain. The work continued through spring and into summer, and as it continued, Eli began to understand something fundamental about building and rebuilding, about creation and restoration. The work wasn't just physical, wasn't just about clearing debris and raising walls and hanging doors. It was about connecting past to present, about honoring what had been while creating what would be, about understanding that nothing is truly finished or truly lost as long as someone cares enough to remember and carry forward. The cabin he was building was modest by any standard. 2 rooms, maybe 600 square feet total, just enough space for a man and his essential possessions. He couldn't afford anything grand, and even if he could afford it, his aging body couldn't handle the work of building something large and complicated. But modest didn't mean careless or temporary. He was building it to last, using techniques he'd learned over decades of ranch work, applying skills he'd developed through countless projects for other people, putting into his own home the kind of care and attention he'd given to buildings that would never belong to him. The foundation was stone and concrete, dug deep below the frost line, so winter's freezing and thawing wouldn't crack or shift it. He'd scavenged some of the stone from the original house's foundation, cleaning and sorting and reusing stones that Elijah had laid 60 years ago. There was rightness to that reuse, a kind of continuity that pleased him every time he placed one of those old stones into the new foundation. Elijah's work was becoming part of Eli's work, the past literally supporting the present, creating a structure that was both new and ancient, both his and theirs. The frame was going up using lumber he'd bought from the mill in the larger town 40 miles away. But he was using Elijah's tools to cut and shape and join the boards. The hammer felt right in his hand, perfectly balanced from decades of use. The saw cut true, its teeth still sharp because someone had cared enough to maintain it properly. Every time Eli drove a nail or cut a board, he felt connected to the man who'd built the original house. Felt like they were collaborating across the decades, building together even though they'd never met and never would. The work was hard, harder than anything he'd done in years. His 60-year-old body complained loudly and often about the demands he was placing on it. His back ached every morning, his shoulders burned by every evening. His hands were perpetually sore despite the thick calluses he'd developed over a lifetime of labor. But there was satisfaction in the pain, a kind of rightness to it. This pain was earned, was the price of creating something, was the physical manifestation of determination and commitment. Every ache was proof that he was still trying, still fighting, still refusing to give up despite every good reason to do so. The community's attitude had shifted gradually over the months he'd been working. Martha's initial skepticism had given way to something like respect, and she'd become his informal supplier of both goods and gossip, telling him what was happening in Ashford, connecting him to the town even though he lived 12 miles away in isolation. Tom Ridley had stopped by twice more, no longer trying to talk him out of his purchase, but instead offering advice about local contractors if Eli needed help with anything beyond his capabilities. A few other ranchers from nearby properties had driven out to see what he was doing, approaching with the caution of people who'd heard the stories about cursed land, but couldn't quite resist checking on the stranger who was crazy enough to try again. One of these visitors was a man named Henry Carson, who ranched the property to the east of Eli's land. Henry was in his 50s, weathered and competent-looking, and he'd driven over one Saturday afternoon and spent an hour walking around the property with Eli, examining the work, offering suggestions, and finally saying, "You know, I knew the Brennans. Tom and Ellen. They were good people, didn't deserve what happened to them. None of us ever understood who'd want to hurt them or why. Some folks said it was connected to the land, to some curse or bad history. But I never believed that. Land is just land. It's people who bring good or bad to it." He'd looked at Eli with an expression that was hard to read. "You're doing something different here. The others who tried, they all came in thinking they knew better than the land, thinking they could force it to be what they wanted. But you're working with what's here, using the old stone, keeping the layout, respecting what came before. Maybe that's the difference. Maybe the land responds to respect more than force." After Henry left, Eli had thought about those words a lot. Was he really doing something different, or was he just fooling himself? Was respect for the past going to matter when winter came and tested the strength of his building, when bills came due and tested the depth of his savings, when his aging body finally gave out and tested the limits of what one man could accomplish alone? He didn't know the answers to those questions, couldn't know them until time provided the test and revealed the results. But he kept working, kept building, kept placing one board on top of another, and trusting that the accumulation of small efforts would eventually result in something whole and functional and lasting. By midsummer, the cabin was enclosed enough to move into. It wasn't finished. There was still interior work to do, trim to hang, windows to properly install, but it had a roof that didn't leak, and walls that kept out the wind, and a door that locked. More importantly, it had a wood stove that Eli had used from a ranch that was closing down, a solid iron stove that would heat the space through Montana winters and provide a cooking surface besides. The first night Eli slept inside the cabin rather than in his truck was a milestone he'd been working toward for months. He lay in his sleeping bag on the bare floor. He hadn't built a bed yet, hadn't gotten around to that particular piece of furniture, and felt the profound satisfaction of being inside a structure he'd created with his own hands. This was his house, his shelter, his home, not someone else's bunkhouse or a truck bed or a tent pitched on rented ground, but a building that belonged to him because he'd made it exist through his own effort. He thought about Elijah and Rose. That night, imagined them having a similar experience 60 years ago, lying in their newly completed house and feeling the same satisfaction, the same pride, the same sense of having accomplished something significant. They'd had more time than he would have. They'd been young, with decades presumably stretching ahead of them. He was old, with maybe 10 or 15 good years left if he was lucky. But the satisfaction was probably the same. The pride in having built something, in having turned imagination into reality through work and determination and refusal to quit, that transcended age and circumstance and the specific details of any individual story. As autumn arrived and the days grew shorter, Eli pushed himself to complete as much as possible before winter made outdoor work impossible. The barn needed to be functional before snow came. Jasper deserved proper shelter, and Eli needed space to store hay and supplies and tools. He worked long days, starting before sunrise and continuing past sunset by lantern light when necessary, driven by the knowledge that Montana winters were unforgiving and preparation mattered. It was during this push to finish the barn that he found the collection of hand tools he'd been using, and he was struck again by their quality and care. These were craftsman's tools, maintained by someone who understood that tools were extensions of yourself, that they deserved respect and proper maintenance. He imagined Elijah sitting in this same barn 60 years ago, sharpening these same saws, oiling these same handles, preparing for tomorrow's work. The tools connected them across the decades, made them collaborators in the work of building and maintaining, partners in the effort to create something lasting in a place where nothing seemed to last as long as it should. He began to realize that he was building more than just structures. He was building a kind of memorial, a testimony to everyone who'd tried to make a life here, to Elijah and Rose who'd started it, to the families who'd struggled to maintain it, to the Brennans who died trying to succeed where others had failed. Every board he hung, every nail he drove, every stone he placed was both practical construction and sacred remembrance. He was building shelter, yes, but he was also building memory, creating a place where the past and present could coexist, where what had been lost could be partially recovered, where broken dreams could be given a second chance at completion. The work became meditation, became prayer, became the way he made sense of his own life and choices. Every mistake he'd made, every person he'd failed, every dream he'd abandoned, all of it was being addressed here, in this place, through this work. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't reclaim the years he'd wasted or repair the relationships he'd broken. But he could do this. He could take what was broken and make it whole. He could honor what had been lost. He could prove that trying mattered, even in failure, and that determination could sometimes overcome circumstances that seemed insurmountable. By the time the first snow fell in late October, Eli had accomplished more than he'd thought possible. The cabin was functional, the barn was weather-tight, and Jasper had a proper stall with solid walls and clean straw and protection from the wind. It wasn't much by most standards, just a tiny cabin and a partially restored barn on 60 acres of grass. But it was more than Eli had owned in his entire life, more than he'd ever dared to hope for, more than he'd thought he was capable of creating. He stood in the snow that first evening, watching the flakes fall soft and silent around him, and felt something he hadn't felt in decades: contentment. Not happiness exactly, not the kind of joy that comes from perfect circumstances or fulfilled desires. But contentment, the quiet satisfaction of being where you're supposed to be, doing what you're supposed to be doing, building what matters even if no one else ever sees or appreciates the work. The locket and diary sat on a shelf in his cabin now, carefully preserved, daily reminders of whose work he was continuing. Elijah and Rose's faces looked out from the photograph, young and hopeful and unaware of the hardships that would come. But they'd tried, they'd built, they'd loved enough to risk everything on a dream, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the lesson Eli carried forward into each day and each task, that trying mattered more than succeeding, and that the courage to build again after failure was perhaps the most valuable human quality, the thing that separated those who merely survived from those who lived with purpose and meaning. As winter deepened and the ranch lay quiet under snow, Eli worked inside on smaller projects, building furniture, improving the cabin's interior, maintaining tools, planning for spring. He was living on savings that were dwindling faster than he'd hoped, surviving on simple food and few comforts, but he was surviving. He was making it. He was proving that one old man with determination and a donkey for company could take cursed land and make it into something like home, and spring would come. It always did. When it came, he'd begin the next phase. Not just maintaining, but expanding. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just honoring the past, but building a future. He'd finish what Elijah and Rose had started. He'd prove that their dream wasn't impossible, just interrupted. He'd show that love and work, given enough time and determination, could overcome even the accumulated bad luck of decades. But that was future work. Tonight, in the quiet of his small cabin with Jasper secure in the barn and snow falling soft outside, Eli was content to simply be here, to have made it this far, to have built something that sheltered him through the Montana winter. He'd done more than he'd thought possible, and tomorrow he'd do more still, because that's what building required. The daily choice to continue, to add one more board, or drive one more nail, or place one more stone. The accumulation of small efforts that eventually resulted in something whole, something lasting, something worth the cost of creation. Eli fell asleep that night to the sound of wind outside and the crackling of fire in the wood stove, warm and safe in a shelter he'd built with his own hands, connected across decades to all the other people who'd tried to build homes in this hard, beautiful place. And in the morning, he'd wake and make coffee and begin again, because that's what you did when you'd finally found your place and your purpose. You kept going. You kept building. You kept honoring the past while creating the future. And maybe, if you were lucky and stubborn and determined enough, you succeeded where others had failed. Or maybe you failed too, but failed trying, failed building, failed doing work that mattered and honored those who'd come before. Either way, the trying was enough. The building was enough. The refusal to give up in the face of history and reputation and reasonable doubt, that was enough. That was everything. That was what made a life worth living, regardless of its ultimate outcome. As 1974 gave way to 1975, Eli Boone was still there, still working, still building on cursed land that was slowly, through determination and respect and simple stubborn refusal to quit, becoming something else, becoming home.